Welcome to the February 2021 Council of Georgist Organizations monthly webinars. I'm Sue Walton, the administrator of the council, and I'm joined by Dan Sullivan, our president, Polly Cleveland, and our speaker, Richard John. And I'd like to thank our sponsors, Polly Cleveland, Mario Cordovo, Kathleen Cummings, Damon Gross, Gib Halverson, Sue Hunsel, Dave Jassels, Ralph Rivera, Mark Sullivan, Asamu Uehara, the Center for Public Dialogue and Walt Rybeck, Earth Sharing Associates, the Henry George Institute, the International Union for Land Value Taxation, the Public Revenue Education Council, and the Robert Schockenbach Foundation.
And our host tonight is Polly Cleveland, who I don't know as much about her as I should, except I've known she's been a Georgist for longer than I have, and has been involved in Georgist economics for a long time, and has been active at Columbia University. But I think she probably give a better bio than I can. I just know that she's been very dedicated and has found us some excellent guest speakers. And she will introduce our guest speaker, Richard John, and I will step off the video so that can be done. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Yes, it is my great pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker, who is a professor, Richard John, who is a professor of history and communications at the Columbia Journalism School at Columbia University. He teaches courses on the history of capitalism and the history of communications. He has written many essays. He has edited 8 books and published 2 monographs. One of them is the history of the postal system in the 19th century, and that book is called Spreading the News, the American Postal System from Franklin to Morse, published 1995, and a book on the history of the telegraph and telephone in the 19th and early 20th century. That's Network Nation, Inventing American Telecommunications. He has co-edited a book called Capital Gains, Business and Politics in the 20th Century, in 20th Century America, along with one of my favorite scholars, Kim Phillips Fine. And he's currently on a Guggenheim Fellowship to produce a book entitled The Anti-Monopolists, The Prophets of Possibility, from Benjamin Franklin to FDR. Tonight, he'll be speaking on the relevance of the ideas of the brilliant but neglected 19th century political economist Henry George for the regulation of the tech platforms. So Richard, take it away.
Thank you very much, Polly, and thank you very much, the Council of Georgist Organizations, Dan Sullivan. See if I can get the screen share up. Okay, yeah. The topic that I've chosen to speak on for the next 40 minutes or so, probably a bit less given the constraints of the medium, is for a historian somewhat eccentric. Historians are better explaining what happened than what didn't happen, or for that matter, hasn't happened yet. And the question I've posed to myself is, why is Henry George, renowned in his day as a critic of monopoly power, ignored by today's critics of big tech? Implicit in this first question, but ignoring Henry George, is the second question: how might George's critique of monopoly power help us better understand how lawmakers might best restructure new media for the common good? And to answer these questions, I'd like to begin with a quotation by a famous 19th century American who was not Henry George. The quotation dates from 1827 and is typical of a sentiment that found its way into countless mid-19th century pamphlets, newspapers, and magazines. This is a common idea. Here's the quotation. Quote, "The attraction of gravity," the writer began, "is the great principle of motion in the natural world." Attraction of gravity. Well, the possession of the earth in fee simple by the cultivator, the farmer, is the great principle of action in the moral world. So gravity, fee simple ownership, analogized. The author next went on to underscore the implications of this observation. Nearly all the political evils which have afflicted mankind, the author goes on to say, have resulted from the unrighteous monopoly of the earth, and the predicted renovation can never be accomplished until this monopoly shall have passed away and the earth is extensively tilled by the independent owners of the soil. Well, the author of that remarkable peroration, well known to historians of the period, is not remembered to posterity as a land reformer. And as the date of the passage makes plain, it predates anything, not only anything that Henry George might have written, but also anything that might have poured forth from the fertile pen of the land reformer George Henry Evans. The words unrighteous and renovation, as some of you might have guessed, hold a clue, as does the following passage, and this is the last passage I'm going to read from this document, quote, "When we contemplate the unexampled resources of this country in men, soil, climate, seacoasts, rivers, lakes, canals, agriculture, commerce, arts, and wealth, and all in connection with the influence of republican and religious institutions, it is too much to be hoped that God will accept our powerful instrumentality and make it effectual. Is it too much to be hoped that God will accept our powerful instrumentality and make it effectual for the renovation of the world, fee simple land ownership?" Well, the author, like George and his father, as you might have surmised by now, is a devout evangelical Protestant. In fact, he was one of the most famous evangelical Protestant preachers of the entire 19th century, Lyman Beecher. His sermon was a rallying cry for the faithful to hasten the spiritual transformation that historians have called the Second Great Awakening. What does this have to do with Henry George and tech platforms? Well, it helps me to make three simple points that will enable me to put George's ideas in a context that in my reading of the literature is too often overlooked. So here are my three simple points. Point one, George's critique of land speculation was a 19th century commonplace. It was so ubiquitous, in fact, that it's pointless to try to trace specific influences on George. George's Our Land and Land Policy, which he published in 1870, was of course inspired in large part by his revulsion at the enormous land grants that Congress lavished on the transcontinental railroads. But this revulsion grew out of a broader critique of the unrighteous monopoly of the land that had troubled Beecher in 1827, that lay behind the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, an anti-monopoly law whose enormous significance has recently been highlighted by Barry Lynn in his Liberty from All Masters. So the Northwest Ordinance is back, but not Henry George. This 1873 lithograph, can I get to it? Yes. Anti-monopoly, which is probably inspired by a farmer-backed campaign to regulate railroad rates, in which cheap farms offer up an alternative to factory labor. This illustrates the promise of accessible land for George's contemporaries. Okay, that's the first point. A lot of discussion, land speculation, land ownership. Not just Henry George, but it's important. It's central to the period. Second point, this is obvious in the passage I quoted by Beecher, but perhaps less obvious for present-day readers of Henry George, is that the establishment by the government of policies to hasten the widespread distribution of land was at its core a morally charged project, not only to improve the lot of ordinary people, but also to hasten the millennium, the 1,000-year reign of God on earth. Progress in Poverty is many things, and it's a remarkable book that I hope everyone in the audience has read. But it's by no means least an inspiring call to action for the country's reformed-minded Christians, Protestant and Catholic. For in this period, as William Jennings Bryan's long career as an anti-monopolist reminds us, evangelicalism leaned left as often as it leaned right. So that's point two. But point one, this is important. Second, this is a religious moral dimension. And the final point that Beecher's sermon underscores, and perhaps the most basic point of all, is that the word monopoly conjured up for 19th century contemporaries a panoply of images, all of them pejorative, many of them politically fraught, some of them downright horrific. Monopoly in this period, in short, was far more than the mere deadweight triangle loss of Economics 101. Its multiple meanings dated back to the Enlightenment and would have been familiar to the founders of the Republic. Almost everyone, as it were, was in one fashion or another an anti-monopolist. The only real issue lay in how this menace was to be defined and what we're going to do about it. So when 19th century Americans decried monopoly, those are my three basic points. I laid them out. I'm going on. When Americans decried monopoly, they had in mind one of three very different targets. It meant three things. One, it could be a government-backed trade policy. Two, a set of institutional arrangements. Or three, a business practice. Each regarded monopoly not only as an economic harm, but also as a mode of political domination. The government trade policy that most troubled contemporaries, beginning with John Adams, was Great Britain's policy. The institutional arrangements that sparked the most concern revolved around corporate charters, patents, and land, and the business practices that grated the most revolved around discriminatory pricing, not only for end users, or what we today would call consumers, but also for producers, who confusingly, though significantly, were also often referred to as consumers of a public good such as the carriage of freight or the provisioning of electricity or gas. Now look, connect the dots, intellectual genealogies can be beguiling. Anti-monopolists, like all reformers, have been eager to invent a usable past, and several historians and most journalists have presumed that there has existed in the United States a single, more or less coherent anti-monopoly tradition that linked Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, Louis Brandeis with the anti-monopoly activists of our own age. In my view, this presumption obscures the vast changes that separated the 1760s from the 1880s, a decade that culminated in 1890 with the enactment of the federal antitrust law, known somewhat dubiously after John Sherman, because he really didn't have much to do with the final draft. And it also obscures the even bigger change between 1890 and the present. So there's no single tradition. There are different persuasions in time, and I've listed three. Nothing can be gained and much is lost by restricting our understanding of anti-monopoly to a legal remedy to a technical problem in corporate governance. In addition, in particular importance of our lecture today, if that's your understanding of anti-monopoly, it leaves out Henry George. We wouldn't want to do that. Now, the presumption that the British government craved commercial domination, that is to say, that was the dominant meaning of monopoly for the revolutionary generation, that would find its way into popular oratory and the press for many decades after the War of 1812. In fact, that conflict, opposition to the alleged monopoly of British merchants, was a major casus belli. Okay, so that's one kind of monopoly, the monopoly of British commerce. Yet, as Beecher's sermon made plain, a no less insidious monopoly lurked closer to home. And what monopoly was that? Well, the monopoly of land. British commercial monopoly imperiled American independence. The land monopoly violated natural rights. Now, the fundamental premise of the natural rights argument is straightforward, as many of you know better than I do. God had granted every human being the right not only to the fruits of his labor, but also to natural resources, land, air, water. To enable human beings to cultivate their faculties, it was imperative that they be given access to education. And I say they, but the contemporaries mostly meant he. It was illogical to link it, to limit this presumption to the men, but it was hard for all but the most radical of land reformers to conceive of this natural rights being extended in the same way to women, or for that matter, to African Americans. And there hangs a tale for another talk. Then the Civil War would transform the monopoly question. Now that chattel slavery had been destroyed, millions of acres of the public domain had been distributed to homesteaders under the Homestead Act. How could it be that millions of Americans remained in poverty? And that's the arresting question that prompted the publication of Henry George's Progress in Poverty, 1879. Progress in Poverty is not only the most widely read book about political economy in the 19th century United States, which is impressive enough. In addition, it was one of the most influential books to have ever been written about political economy, tout court. George's key insight is deceptively simple. No less than John Adams, who was concerned about Britain's commercial monopoly, George deplores monopoly, but it's a different kind of monopoly. For to root out monopoly for George, we need policy reforms in the regulation not of commerce, but of land, or what we would today call natural resources. And that would include for George mineral deposits, timber stands. Natural resources, George reasons, are limited. If the government taxed them, and not, for example, the improvements that landowners had made on the land, the danger of monopoly could be contained. That was the basic presumption. Now, George's conflation of monopoly with the private ownership of natural resources is often overlooked by present-day chroniclers of anti-monopoly thought, though needless to say, it's not overlooked by the audience tonight. In one sense, this neglect is unsurprising. Land ownership is a cherished American value, and George's policy recommendations are not in any way translatable to the present-day assault on big tech. Or are they? Okay, this is the pivot in the talk. Let's consider the case of the telegraph, which was, along with the mail, one of the most widely used communication networks in George's day. George's failure in 1871 to obtain low-cost access for his San Francisco newspaper to the daily news bulletins that were prepared by the New York Associated Press was, as his son later recounted, a pivotal event in his emerging realization that technical advance need not hasten moral progress. He came all the way to New York City to get the New York Associated Press feed, and he fails. The telegraph monster monopoly, slide 3, as one cartoonist termed this network, this insidious thing linking Western Union and the New York Associated Press, this telegraph monster monopoly was derided by journalists whose publications did not have access to the New York Associated Press's dispatches. And why is that? Well, because the New York Associated Press and the Western Union entered into a collusive agreement that gave the New York Associated Press low rates in return for the promise, legally enforced, that the New York Associated Press would say nothing negative about Western Union. We think of the Washington Post today and its ownership. Western Union was one of the most important tech platforms, okay? So this is George's first great encounter with monopoly, with the leading tech platform of his day. Now, George's primary concern in the 1870s is neither the telegraph nor the railroad, but land. The value of real estate, George astutely observed, often owed less to the labor that had been exerted on it by its owner, as natural rights theorists, going back to Locke, had presumed, than by its location. Underutilized land that had been held for speculative purposes in big cities outraged him. Why not put these lots up for auction, he implored, so that, and here I'm quoting, in the heart of the city, no one can afford to keep land from its most profitable use. He wasn't only or primarily concerned with farmland in thinly settled areas or along railroad, big city vacant lots. Should property laws be reframed to encourage urban dwellers to live in closer proximity, it would foster the habits of sociability that were so necessary to cultural refinement, technical advance, and a healthy civic life. At his most radical, George sought nothing less than the elimination of wage labor for the benefit of all. The most valuable work, in George's view, was almost never the byproduct of necessity. George was very clear on this point, and here I quote, "The work which improves the condition of mankind, the work which extends knowledge and increases power and enriches literature and elevates thought is not done to secure a living, On the contrary, creativity was a byproduct of leisure, a habit of mind that would remain alien to the many so long as they found themselves saddled by the necessity of engaging in," here I quote again, "uncongenial employment," unquote. To make people industrious, prudent, skillful, and intelligent, they must be relieved from want. Say that again. To make people industrious, prudent, skillful, and intelligent, they must be relieved from want. Like the political economist Thorstein Veblen, whose theory of workmanship was reminiscent of and almost certainly indebted to George's own reflections on innovation and craftsmanship, George praises industriousness which he associates somewhat paradoxically perhaps with leisure. George derides pecuniary gain, which he associates with greed. Remember that, we'll come back to that point. If no one feared poverty and the covetousness that the fear of poverty inspired, inventive activity would be enormously increased. In fact, the aggregate of production was for George greatly reduced by the greed with which riches are pursued. Why was this? Millions of people toiled daily to make ends meet, when if their basic needs could be provided for, they'd be free to engage in creative pursuits that were down to the benefit of the many. Only then would the fruits of invention finally be accessible to all. And here a block quote. How infinitesimal are the forces that concur to the advancement of civilization as compared to the forces that lie latent. Think of the promise. Selfishness is not the master motive of human action. Some men who held chairs at universities, George sardonically observed, never dreamed of a better world. George knew better. Now, George loathes bureaucracy and hopes that the business of government might be vastly simplified, and this has made him a hero to libertarians like Albert J. Nock. His hostility toward what would later come to be known as the administrative state might appear to be incompatible with his oft-expressed confidence in government ownership and operation of the telegraph, the railroad, municipal public utilities, including gas works, electric power stations, heating plants. He was in favor of government ownership and operation, all of those, what we would now call public utilities. Yet for George, there's no contradiction here. If competition is impossible, then government ownership is preferable to government regulation. Here, as in the case of private land ownership, the goal is to contain the evil. Fearful of regulatory capture, George regarded ownership as regarded as preferable for the government to own and operate a business that was a monopoly by nature than to oversee its regulation. Like so many of his contemporaries, when he was asked if a public agency could outperform a private corporation, can a public agency outperform a private corporation? George pointed to the post office, a common view in the 1870s, when many informed observers regarded the post office department to be much better managed than Western Union. In the absence of reform, the future is bleak. The perpetuation of the intensifying system of inequality, one of George's phrases, he was deeply concerned with wealth inequality. The perpetuation of this intensifying system of inequality would entail an increasingly intense application of mental power in the service not of the common good, but instead of a reactionary spasm of ostentation, luxury, warfare. The only notable inventions would be refinements in luxury, and not those that relieve toil and increase power. The emergence of vast combines in transportation, communication, industry would compound the problem. And here I quote, "A close corporation has always an instinctive dislike of innovation and innovators." Say that again, Henry George. "A close corporation has always an instinctive dislike of innovation and innovators, which is but the expression of an instinctive fear that change may tend to throw down the barriers that hedge these corporations in, hedge them in from the common herd, and so rob them of importance and power. And it is always disposed to carefully guard its special knowledge or skill." Think algorithms, Google, Facebook, Amazon, controlling resources. To contain these evils, lawmakers had an obligation to design institutional arrangements that combined freedom with cooperation in accordance with the sacred principles of the Declaration of Independence and the Bible. Technical advance, George soberly warned, need not hasten moral progress. On the contrary, technical advance might eventuate not only in mass poverty, but also in the horrors of petrifaction, the fate of every prior civilization. For ordinary people, this would be nothing short of disaster. The wonderful discoveries and inventions of our century have neither increased wages nor lightened toil, he said, echoing John Stuart Mill. The effect has simply been to make the few richer and the many more helpless. The innovations haven't been to the benefit of the many. The choice is clear. To forestall disaster, the monopolization of natural resources, the private monopolization, must be contained. And here I quote, "With steam and electricity and the new powers born of progress, forces have entered the world that will either compel us to a higher plane or overwhelm us, as nation after nation, as civilization after civilization have been overwhelmed before." Unquote. All right, now to the tech link. George's indictment of the private ownership of natural resources may seem unrelated to the present-day challenges that are posed by tech platforms, Google, Facebook, and Amazon. And indeed, that was the conclusion of Barry Lynn in his Liberty from All Masters. For though Lynn traces in this important new book on anti-monopoly thought, he traces what he regards as a unitary anti-monopoly tradition from the founders to the present, he never mentions Henry George. I would like to propose that George's indictment of the innate conservatism of the close corporation, in combination with his faith in the power of creativity and his astute awareness of the economic significance of human sociability, makes him a far better touchstone for present-day debates over the tech platforms than many, if not most, of today's anti-monopolists recognize. Much of the value of Google, Facebook, Amazon lie in their enclosure of the commons, of the choices made by millions of people. Like the owner of a vacant lot, they have commandeered a resource whose value increases as a result of the economic activity that existing institutional arrangements have permitted them to capture. George himself discovered, when he tried to get the New York Associated Press feed for his newspaper, that powerful organizations could mobilize their control over access to information to consolidate power, blunt creativity, and impoverish civic life. And we face a comparable challenge today. George is a champion, in short, not only of workers who are unable to gain access to land, but also of everyone who is stymied by the enclosure of natural resources, with natural resources today including not only real estate, farmsteads, city lots, not only raw materials, mineral deposits, timber stands, but also the collective online consciousness of the population. To tax Google, Facebook, Amazon for what one might well term the unearned increment that they obtain from their users' clicks, search platforms, browsing habits would be a 21st century counterpart of George's tax on the unearned increment on natural resources, such as real estate, raw materials. George regarded natural resources as intrinsically limited. Well, what is the digital counterpart? As the legal scholar Tim Wu has proposed, perhaps the digital counterpart is the enclosure of our collective consciousness, of our online attention. It's perhaps not surprising that the expansiveness of George's critique of the enclosure of natural resources, including the mind, right, is often overlooked, since many 19th century journalists, as well as at least one of their 21st century counterparts, have pigeonholed George incorrectly, in my view, as a one-eyed reformer, a favorite phrase for critics of radical reform, whose obsessive commitment to the single tax rendered him little more than a crank. I disagree. The expansiveness of George's anti-monopolism troubled even journalists who, like Joseph Kepler, frequently inveighed against big business. Consider, for example, this savage cartoon of Henry George as the Mephistopheles of today, wielding the pen of journalistic agitation that Kepler drew for the Democratic-leaning humor magazine during humor magazine, it was called Puck, during the 1886 New York City mayoral campaign, in which George would run second against iron merchant Abram Hewitt, besting patrician reformer and future US President Theodore Roosevelt. Okay, but he's not viewed favorably by Kepler, my point. The radicalism of George anti-monopolism is easily overlooked. We forget just how radical he was. In 2011, for example, the New York Times ran this cartoon, you see it, in an article by Harvard historian Jill Lepore, and it ran with this cut line, quote, "A cartoon of Henry George when he ran for mayor of New York in 1886, unquote." And you can see the New York, in the background, you can see the rendering of the New York City Hall. The essay ran online with these keywords, quote, "The guy who invented populism," unquote, being Henry George, a social movement that Lepore conflated rather dismissively and misleadingly with a single tax. So the point of her article is to suggest there's a single tax proposal today. George proposed it, that's populism, and it's sort of been there, done that. All right. Well, this is not, in fact, what the historical record shows. This cartoon of George, as it happens, was a clumsy reworking of a memorable 1881 cartoon by Kepler that depicted a personification not of George, but of the familiar figure of Liberty confronting a snake that symbolized the corrupt relationship between railroads and the US Senate. Surveying the scene over here, the magazine's mascot, whose name is Puck, that was the name of the magazine too, he plaintively asks Uncle Sam, a stand-in for the civic conscience of the nation, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about the monopoly that has encircled not the New York City Hall, but the capital of the United States? This reworked cartoon casts George in a light more favorable than anything that George himself, than anything that Kepler would have envisioned. The reworked cartoon is the one that I want to show you here. That's the reworked cartoon. It in fact dates not from the early 2000s, not from 1886, but it instead dates from 1951. Another New York Times piece, a book review of The Men of Good Hope by Daniel Aaron, who I'm privileged to say was one of my teachers years ago. So here is Daniel Aaron trying to keep alive an image of Henry George as a radical battling City Hall in New York, but that's a different image than anything that Kepler put forward in 1886. For Aaron, George is a valuable prophet of reform for the post-Second World War United States. Very different from Jill Lepore, very different from Barry Lynn. Lepore and Lynn dismiss him as nothing more than a naive dreamer who knew nothing about greed. And he did know something about greed, as I suggested earlier. The present-day marginalization of George, this is getting to the wrap-up, owes something to the desacralization of public discourse. George's millennialism, while not unknown today in the left and right, it's easily discounted. It's a fiercely religious book, if you've read it through. Harder to dismiss is George's pointed critique of the enclosure of natural resources and his capacious conception of monopoly. Well, all this would have been familiar to his 19th century counterparts, which helps explain why Progress and Poverty would become such a runaway bestseller and prove so enormously influential for so many reformers in the progressive era and beyond. Critics of monopoly in the 1870s were not constrained, as are so many progressives today, by the post-Sherman Act conflation of monopoly with the corporation. On the contrary, their indictment was broader, more political, less narrowly economistic. And these four anti-monopoly cartoons, all from the 1870s, we're now in the lightning round part of my presentation, help to make this point. Two critique the railroad, the ones on the extreme left and right, and two, the telegraph. None depict their foils primarily as a corporation with a recognizable logo, as would be the fashion today. And this is not surprising. Corporate branding was in the future. Instead, they're going after a broader phenomena, political corruption, the intertwining of corporations with governance. And they derive their metaphorical energy not from present-day United States, not from the Kansas prairie, but from European high culture. Here we have Victor Hugo's Toilers of the Sea as an inspiration for the railroader's sea monster, the cephalopod, which later would become another creature we'll talk about in a minute, but that's the very first image of the cephalopod. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, railroader's mad scientist experiment gone horribly wrong, and in the middle, the mythological figures of Laocoon and Andromeda as victims of the corrupt bargain between Western Union and the New York Associated Press. It's not just a corporation, it's this nexus that's the problem. And in so doing, these cartoonists invested monopoly with a capacious, multivalent meaning that transcended instrumental rationality. Their target is much more pretentious than the iconic mid-20th century neoclassical economist deadweight triangle. Robert Bork's imaginative reconstruction of the 19th century world of John Sherman has nothing to do whatsoever with the historical reality. Well, before long, the cephalopod would morph into the octopus. 2 slides, a monster that would terrify social justice conscious-minded Americans for decades to come. And here are a few of the octopi. Some of you are probably familiar with that image. This is a subway portrayed as a monopoly octopus. And there we have perhaps the most famous of all, Joseph Kepler's son, Udo Kepler. Next, will Standard Oil take over the White House during the administration of Teddy Roosevelt? Henry George is a free trader, a policy position that put him at odds with the late 19th century Republican Party and its own anti-monopoly monster. And what is that? The commercial monopoly that British merchants sought after, buttressed by the British government's imperialistic, or perhaps one might say neoliberal, embrace of free trade. That's the Republican counterweight to the mostly democratic octopus. What one might call the Westminster Consensus was for Republican policy wonks in the 1880s no less pernicious than the Washington Consensus would be for policy wonks in the post-1989 Global South. This alternative anti-monopoly critique, a critique of free trade, would lose favor in the post-Second World War United States, given the enormous prestige of neoliberalism. Yet this critique of free trade lay behind Republican support for the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890, which critics derided entirely plausibly as a legislative sham to divert popular attention away from yet another Republican-backed monopoly-enhancing uptick in the tariff schedules. So that's the Democratic view of the Sherman Act. It's really these fat cat senators who are feathering their nests because of their corrupt relationship with big business. Well, here too, and here I'm going to stop, Henry George can be useful to think with. For George recognized, as did his fellow 19th century anti-monopolists, that the United States was enmeshed in a global political economy in which public policy decisions about foreign trade could have profound implications for the standard of living of ordinary Americans. It was a world in which the institutional arrangements that shaped the conduct not only of giant corporations, such as the tech platforms, intrinsically political, but giant corporations nonetheless. These institutional arrangements also shaped the lives of ordinary Americans in ways that had profound consequences, not only for economic development, but also for wealth inequality, natural resource management, civic life, and what the preacher Lyman Beecher would suggestively, if to our ears somewhat optimistically, call the potential for the moral renovation of the world. And that's what I got.
Thank you. I guess I'm audible again. Okay. Thank you. I learned a great deal, and I thought I knew a lot about George and 19th century history, but that was fantastic. I thank you. I have one question here, and I hope other people are now putting up questions in Q&A. This one from Ed Dodson. Do you think that George's entrance into politics was influenced by his thinking that academics was not an effective incubator of social reform?
Excellent question. He famously gives a lecture at Berkeley. I think it's just before the 1886 election, but one of you could correct me on that, in which he more or less goes after his academic sponsors, which is not considered to be a successful strategy to get yourself an academic appointment. But that does say something about the contempt with which he viewed the academic, let's call them social scientists of his day, because economics had not yet been split off and political science was just emerging. He was an autodidact, but he read a great deal. Albert J. Nock wishes he'd read more because his engagement with these European, primarily but not entirely British sources and works on political economy helped to give his Progress and Poverty a cosmopolitanism and a capaciousness that makes it really, in many ways, much more compelling than the early academics. And we are confronted with a similar situation today in which we permitted a very small group of Americans, neoclassical economists, to tell us what the anti-monopoly tradition is. It's extraordinarily arrogant, it's misleading, and it has led to terrible outcomes that Henry George would have deplored.
Okay, let's see. I have a question here from an anonymous attendee. Why did George accept copyright but not patent monopolies?
That's a great question. There's a long footnote about that in Progress and Poverty. And the best I can remember that footnote, I meant to look that up before I came here. But the idea with copyright is that the information is going to circulate and it's accessible to everyone. Whereas with a patent, you could keep the knowledge to yourself. But with a copyright, the information was out there and therefore it would be circulated. But if you want to email me, we can go back and forth on that, because that's a fascinating, really important question that was different from the way many contemporaries saw copyright and patents, because patent system was very strong by 1879, but we had yet to accept an international copyright law.
Okay, here's a question from Justin Reed. 97.9% of Facebook's global revenue was generated from advertising. Did George say anything about advertising specifically?
Good question. I believe that, like Thorstein Veblen, the simple answer is advertising is not a big thing in 1879. It emerges very rapidly in the 1890s. In fact, one reason the muckraking publications are so abundant after 1900 is these magazine editors who are making money hand over fist from advertising have to figure out some way to fill a magazine with content. So they hire all of these celebrity journalists like Ida Tarbell to write these exposés. But to get back to your very, very good question, not much advertising, but he's very concerned about luxury. He has a Veblenian dislike of leisure class, the wealthy leisurely. He wants the poor to be able to be creative, but the wealthy are controlling resources. They're building these big houses, these white elephants, Henry James called them, and that is destructive. Now, what would that have said about the financing of newspapers? His own San Francisco newspaper is small. Of course, it's going to be running advertising because all newspapers ran advertising from the 18th century forward. Jürgen Habermas is just wrong about that. But the advertising that ran in the newspapers were these small squibs. And there were lots and lots of advertisers. So it would have been very hard for a single advertiser or even a team of advertisers to dictate newspaper policy. More pernicious in Henry George's day was the custom of big business and other wealthy groups to simply buy up space in the newspaper and plant their own articles. That was called boilerplate, which is where that comes from. So yes, he would have been aghast, as many of us are at the Columbia Journalism School, at Facebook's business model. About $60 billion has been taken out of journalism in the last decade or so. But this was not a problem that confronted him centrally in 1879. Newspapers were strong. He wishes they would be stronger if the Western Union, New York Associated Press duopoly could be broken, but it was possible for them to thrive on advertising and subscriptions.
Okay, here's one from another anonymous. How would you assess recent scholarship that departs from the dichotomy of nationalize all industry, free enterprise, with the conclusion that George reached nationalize natural monopolies? I feel I don't see much contemporary legal scholarship that says this.
Yeah, well, contemporary legal scholarship has been dominated by a very strong, very small group of reactionary economists who were very troubled after the Second World War by the expansion of the state. And we shifted in that period from looking at, from regarding the corporation or this nexus, like a Western Union, Associated Press nexus of corporations, seeing that as the evil, to seeing government as the evil. And that emerges, you can trace it in the First World War, Second World. So after the Second World War, there's been this revulsion against government ownership. Corporate public relations was invented by AT&T to block government ownership of AT&T. So this was a massive government campaign over many decades. Now, economists following Robert Bork contend that the only standard for breaking up big business is consumer welfare, which was not the standard in 1890. It has become the standard. And that's very convenient for big corporations. And it is even more convenient for this small knit of very well-fed economists who are basically saying that only they know how to call the shots. Do we have enterprises today that are mixed public-private? Well, interstate highway system in the 1950s. Dare I say, the internet. That emerged as a government-funded project. And it would not have taken the character that it did had, if you will, Georgist ideas not been central there, but the idea that it was going to be a government project, monopoly military, and therefore it should not be operated on commercial lines. That has changed, but that was the assumption in the 1960s and 70s. So that's a short answer to a long question. But we need, I believe, to get beyond this conceptual logjam. We permitted a small group of people to define the public good in a way that is inimical to the kind of civic life that would have been understood by the founders, understood by Lyman Beecher, understood by Henry George. And I'm hoping that the efflorescence today of brilliant anti-monopoly scholarship by Lina Khan, by Tim Wu, by Matt Stoller, by Barry Lynn, by Zephyr Teachout, many others, will help us to refashion our kind of mental architecture so we can get ourselves back in touch with the American heritage. So we're no longer on this deviant path that we've been sort of confronted with since the post-Second World War and the rising prestige of academic economics.
Well, so much for academic economics. Question from Don Shoup. Was urban land ownership more concentrated in 1879 than it is now?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer. I do know that Henry George is very troubled by vacant lots. And the popular board game Monopoly was originally devised by, it was Elizabeth Meiji, who was a Georgist, to explain why it doesn't make sense to make money by sitting on property that you do not develop. You should be able to develop a boardwalk or park place, but why are they so much more valuable than Mediterranean or Baltic? Well, it's location, location, location. And that is not due to the intrinsic investment in the hotels or houses. All the hotels and houses are the same in that board game. I'm making an analogy here because I don't know the answer to your good question, and somebody may well be someone in the group does.
Okay, here's one from Australia. I told you there'd be people here from Australia. This is Carl Fitzgerald, and he's writing, here in Australia, Facebook has aggressively turned off news feeds in the last 24 hours on the pages of major news agencies, health departments, and even major NGOs. Why? Because our government wants Facebook to pay Murdoch and other news outlets for their work. What solutions do you foresee in the modern era to deal with big tech's power? Are solutions limited to antitrust regulations only? There you go.
Let me begin by commending the Australian government and anyone from Australia in the audience, because you are leading the way. This is the way of the future if we are to have a progressive future. We need to challenge the arrogant business strategy of Facebook based on advertising without generating content for the public good. Now, does Facebook have the right to shut off the news sites? Yes. Emily Bell has a Twitter feed about this today. BELL, my colleague at Columbia, you can read it. Is it arrogant? Does it show that the business strategy of this huge corporation is really inimical to the best interest of the people of Australia and other countries? Yes. But that's what they've done, and they're within their rights to do it. Google, my understanding is, and this is a breaking story, is taking a somewhat different path. But I all hail the Australians for showing us the way. And we don't know how this is going to go forward in the future, but I do not believe that antitrust is the only or even the primary tool. I think we need to find other solutions. And Henry George's conviction that these resources are social, that sociability is not anything that somebody or some corporation can commodify, can help us lead the way. And so that I cannot put it any more strongly than that. And by the way, the information infrastructure in 10 years is not going to look like the information infrastructure today. Facebook Google, Amazon, they're all very recent corporations. And in fact, the founders are still active in at least two of the three. So that's going to change. And I hope that just as the Australians helped to lead the way with the secret ballot, which Henry George helped to introduce in the United States, the Australians can help to lead the way in regulating the tech platforms, and in the spirit of Henry George.
Wow, thank you. Let's see, Sean Levan, the Georgist critique of close corporations was mentioned in your discussion. Technological platforms answering to the interests of global advertisers can be analogized to this model. How can a bipartisan consensus emerge to recognize the unearned increment ensuing from special CDA immunity, whatever that is not afforded to domestic broadcast media?
So we're talking about the Communication Decency Act of
Okay, yeah.
We're talking about Section 230. Look, we can have a whole hour on Section 230. My view is it needs to be reformed. It was originally added legislation for a very limited purpose, and now, for reasons that I think are partly, if not largely, misguided, it's been taken over by libertarians as this kind of foundational document of the information age. I do not believe that it is. I do not have a concrete proposal for how to regulate it. I believe that we should limit its extent. It was the gift to Facebook, Google. They didn't know it was a gift because it came about in '96 and those corporations came about later. But that's a basic point. The regulation came first, okay? The platform came first. The governmental infrastructure, the legislative platform came first, and the corporations piggybacked on the back of it. Political structure shaped business strategy. And there's no reason why lawmakers should not be able to get together to change the political structure today. I'm not in the Beltway. I'm not to figure out how you're going to bring consensus, but I have noted that there are quite conservative Republicans, including a fellow from Missouri by the name of Hawley, who's very interested in regulating platform monopolies. And that suggests to me that there may be a way to bring together the two sides in Washington. But how that's going to happen, not my department, as they say, but when it does happen, I'll be happy to write about it.
Well, let me just add to that. Do you have any particular thoughts as to what might be the right way to implement Georgist solutions?
Yeah. At the municipal level, broadband and funding for journalism and other public service information. Information is not all the same. This is one of the problems with this. I think it's a very misleading metaphor. Probably some of the people haven't heard of it anymore, but it was very popular for a couple of years, called net neutrality. The idea was that all bytes were just the same, zipping around on the internet. Well, that's not true. Some information is so much more valuable than other information. And we should recognize that. And that is the common carriage tradition in the United States. That's how railroad was regulated. That's how telegraph was regulated. That's how telephone was regulated. So if we begin to recognize that information is not all, it's not all the same, then we can begin to establish some kind of parameters kind of around which we could then establish regulations to promote civically valuable information and other kinds of, there's lots of kinds of information that people want to know. Just about what's going on in your neighborhood or what's going on with your friend, that kind of information. But that has all been commodified for the sake of advertisers who are selling our attention is, I believe, a future generation will conclude just as monstrous as the monopolies that Lyman Beecher and Henry George derided.
Speaking of selling our attention, I know there have been proposals to make, well, Twitter, maybe Facebook too, subscribers, right. Operate by subscribers and thus limit the advertising. I don't know whether you have any opinions on that, but.
I'm of the view that Facebook is a public utility. It's just we haven't reached a consensus that it is. And it took a long time for Western Union to become regarded as a public utility, from 1845 to 1900. That's a long time. Telephone, 1910, 1845 to 1910. Telephone, the same, 1879 to 1910. I believe they're public utilities. There's room to make money in public utilities. There's room to make money with corporations that operate under common carrier laws. public utility, common carriage, in my view, and that of legal minds, minds much more brilliant than mine, and legal minds such as Lena Khan's, they recognize that this is a place we should look. Public utility law, common carriage law, this exclusive focus on antitrust is, I think, a mistake.
If how does the telegraph make money, though? I mean, as an analogy to Facebook, I mean,
all right, how did the
they
telegraph
charge you a small fee, but who uses telegraph anymore?
All right, I'm talking here about 19th century when the telegraph was the 800-pound gorilla. It was extraordinarily profitable. It was limited in its market. That is to say, it did not appeal to ordinary people. So the better analogy for today is telephone.
Mm-hmm.
It was regulated from the beginning inside the big cities, and in order to prevent the telephone from being, in effect, extorted by corrupt city aldermen, because they exist then and they exist now, telephone managers decided to change their business strategy to make it more accessible to many and to provide a high quality of service. Now, they're not content providers, so it's not a perfect analogy. But look, the newspapers are the closest historical analogy to the kind of high quality information content we want today. The top year for advertising in the United States, advertising revenue for newspapers, is 2005, which is not very long ago. Newspapers were making a great deal of money up to that time. They were fat, dumb, and happy, and then suddenly the deluge came. We need to find a way, a mixed system with advertising, subscription, public funding to promote high quality journalism, not only national, I mean, that'll take care of itself, the presidential election, but especially in state capitals and in cities and towns. And the basic lesson in the history of journalism, the political economy of journalism, is that news has never paid for itself. Say that again. News has never paid for itself, but it's always been commercial. And that's because there were these subsidies built into the news medium itself. And I could go over those subsidies at great length. I've written a lot about it. So have others, such as Victor Pickard, Robert McChesney. But that's the basic bottom line here, that we need to recognize that news has always existed in a heavily subsidized environment in which there's been support from the advertisers for high quality information. Today, we've got almost exactly the opposite, and left, right, and center, the consequences with social media, with the algorithmic tweaking of people's sensibilities to get more and more radical content is disastrous. And so I would like to believe that we're reaching a tipping point. And when we reach that tipping point, I really hope that young people will start reading Henry George again.
So do I. Here's a question, another question from Ed Dodson. Is there today a rebirth of interest in studying the history of the land question raised by George and also related to the frontier thesis of Frederick Jackson Turner?
This is a fascinating question, and I've been doing a lot of research on this. I'm writing a book on anti-monopoly, and it came to me as a great surprise that when I got to the progressive era, the period between 1900 and the First World War, the kind of Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft era in the United States, the debates over natural resource management, coal lands, timber stands, other minerals, not gold and silver, but there's a lot to do there with coal and timber stands. It was debated in terms of anti-monopoly presumptions. That is to say, these are natural resources that we should not permit to be privately owned, and they should be collectively owned and leased. And then we can tax the leased resource. So that is the presumption. And it would seem to me that without being a student of 20th century land use policy, those are a set of assumptions that we could apply to thinking about sort of the commons, the mental commons. There was a concept of a commons. There was resistance to enclosure of the commons. And they actually sometimes talked about the enclosure movement in Britain, which happened 100 years or several hundred years earlier. So there may well be opening here, but I would suggest if anyone's interested in thinking about Georgist principles in land use policy to read the congressional record between 1900 and 1914, because there's an awful lot of material, including some speeches by Henry George's own son on this subject, who was in Congress during that period.
Wow. From Mark Sullivan, can you elaborate on HG's view that creative labor and social progress requires widespread leisure as opposed to the struggle to survive?
This is a great question, and it really surprised me. And it's one of the most inspiring features of Progress and Poverty when you read it. George is self-taught. He's an autodidact like Benjamin Franklin. He's a poor boy. He didn't go to college. He went to sea. He loves books. He worked in a printing shop. The first edition of Progress and Poverty he actually set himself, because no printer would publish it. So this is somebody, think of his own background, kind of an evangelical, Anglican, Episcopalian. His father was a bookseller. He loves the world of ideas and creativity, yet he's had a great difficulty making a living. Okay, he wants the world to be more friendly to people like him. And what's wrong with that? So that's where this basic presumption comes from, that young people should be able to go to college and study what they want to study without feeling they're burdened with debt that's going to saddle them for the next 30 years. So I feel he'd be in favor of abolishing student debt. He would be in favor of support for community colleges, 2 years funded. He would be in favor of support for public libraries, for subventions for publishing. But the bigger issue here is, and this is hard to get our heads around, okay? The bigger issue is he does not really believe in the wage system. Wages, the idea you would work for a wage for a certain period of time, and then you'd come home, and then you'd have your own time, so somebody else's time and your time, and you'd sometimes have to work extremely hard. The standard of living was lower. People really were at the margins. That seemed to him to be repellent. And that's one of the reasons he's so enthusiastic about homesteads and about the ability of ordinary people to get, mostly men with their wives and children, that was the model and the patriarchal model, on a homestead, because you could have a measure of independence. So you could have a measure of independence as a artisan or even as a small shopkeeper. And you don't have to be pushed to work hard in order to make money for somebody else. Okay? That's what the wage system has become. You work hard for somebody else. And that was not a world that Henry George was envisioning in Progress and Poverty. In fact, there are very few corporations in Progress and Poverty. Like Abraham Lincoln, he entertained the basic idea that if you're an able-bodied man and you're of middle age, you should be able to get yourself a farm and support yourself without working for anybody else. And I think that's an idea that has a certain intuitive persuasiveness for Americans today. It's an idea you can find in Henry George, and it's one of the many reasons that makes the book such a riveting read.
Mm-hmm. See, here is just a thank you from Susie Pack. I just want to say the whole historiographical debate that contextualizes the talk in economics and talk in economics and history is fascinating. Thank you from Susie Pack, and this is from our Columbia Economic History Seminar.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, hi, Susie.
Yeah. Okay, from Josh Hawn. Would Henry George consider the network effects which benefit modern tech platforms to be socially generated value?
Of course. I mean, that would have been so obvious to Henry George that you wouldn't even have had to argue it. I mean, he doesn't want to break up the post office into lots of little units. He doesn't want to break up the telegraph. In fact, the metaphor that would have come to him, and it seems unfamiliar to us today, perhaps, is that God gave us the air, God gave us steam, and that these are great gifts, and that we should then use them. The problem with monopoly, let me put this as clearly as I can. The problem with monopoly in the 1870s was not that businesses were too big. The problem was that businesses were too small. They were so small that they were, in effect, taking resources out They were making money by limiting access. And Western Union was a classic example. It was much less accessible than the British and the French telegraph network. They were hoarders. That's what the corporations were. They were reactionary hoarders that were sitting on big piles of money in order to build fancy houses and to have these elaborate balls while the poor were starving. Okay? So he's in favor of bigger networks. The farmers, in fact, if you read Charles Postel's brilliant 2 books, first on the Populists and then on the debate over equality, Postel, he argues that the farmers were the great champions of bigness. They want more facilities to bring their crops to market. They want farm cooperatives. They're not small as beautiful. Acolyte. The idea that the American anti-monopoly movement is fundamentally a small as beautiful movement has no warrant in the historical record of the 19th century.
Wow. Here is Christopher Terry. Providing access, whether through broadband or otherwise, does not account for the role of the user. How do you resolve the issue that users don't want to expose themselves to alternative viewpoints? And he adds, I was one of Jim Bauman's students.
Yeah, look, I don't believe that Americans have ever been that enthusiastic about exposing themselves to alternative viewpoints. I don't really think that's the key issue. The question is what are the incentives for the platforms, particularly Facebook? If you've seen the movie, what is it called? Social something, all about the way the algorithms are designed. The algorithms are designed to send you into more and more extreme media. So if you were reading, the Chicago Tribune in the 1930s, you were sympathetic to Mussolini, hostile to FDR, did not want the United States to fight in the Second World War. Okay, that's your point of view. You're not necessarily going to be reading, The Nation or something. You've got a worldview. That's not the issue. And John Stuart Mill, for all of his brilliance on liberty, which is the classic statement for opposing viewpoints, there are all kinds of parameters limiting opposing viewpoints. Only adults, no children, nobody in Asia, nobody in China. Basically, you got to be as well educated as John Stuart Mill, debater. And so I believe that there's an unrealistic assumption here about the quote unquote marketplace of debate, an extremely misleading and in many ways confused metaphor that's a 20th century lineage that has helped big corporations and in particular pornographers to create a vision of the public sphere that would not have been recognizable to Henry George. So that's again a pretty strong statement here, but we need to get beyond this idea that there's something called the marketplace of ideas that is the American way. Competition, yes, but there were limits. Look, in the American Revolution, if you were a loyalist publishing a newspaper in Boston, you'd either be tarred and feathered or run out of town. We don't have a tradition of access to a million different voices. I don't know any model of social psychology in which that makes sense. But what we've got right now is a model in which the eyeballs, we are the products, our eyeballs are being commodified by corporations that have zero interest in the quality of information. Now, Google is somewhat different, and you see this in Australia. But the social media platforms that claim they're not concerned about quality, want us to make choices, that is a crock. And that is leading us to a place where we do not want to be. It's leading us to January 6th, and it's leading us to a continued impasse in politics.
Wow. Okay, here's a question from Deb Cooper. You just mentioned money for journalism. The Alder Group just purchased the Tribune Publishing Company, which owns papers like the Hartford Courant, Sun Sentinels in Florida, and other. Local newspapers are essential for the valid functioning of democracy. Any ideas on how to do that?
That was a terrible day for American journalism. Those are great papers. And of course, newspapers have been hollowed out for decades. We've got to find a way to get these kind of big, capital pots of money out of the business, because they're going to come in, they're going to strip assets, and then they're going to make money on what's left. And we've seen that happen time and time and time again. So the answer is some model combination of subscription, public service, government funding. And of course, whatever advertising you can pick up. But we're no longer going to be in a situation unless we have a change with the platforms, which I should think that the platforms, I think, looking at you, Facebook, should be concerned about. If that doesn't change, then we have a problem. What I'm hoping is going to happen is that Facebook is going to get out of the news business altogether. Just stop letting you post news. And then there might then be an opening for other platforms. But for all the journalists out there, this is a tough time to be a journalist, but there's never been a time when your work has not been more important.
Well, I did see that a local millionaire, billionaire just purchased the Baltimore Sun,
Yes.
snatched it away from the Alder Group. So that's, I suppose, good news since he's local.
Right. Talk about one of the great newspapers in American history. It just tears your heart out to see those papers being torn apart.
Let's see. Here's one from James Frederickson. I don't think I asked this. Asserts that the Quebec Act of 1774 was a major cause of the Revolutionary War. Do you agree with that assertion?
This is the act that limits the colonists to the seaboard and prevents them from going across the Appalachian Mountains. And the implication is therefore that hems the colonists in and prevents them from getting access to Western land. And that was certainly a concern. How effective it was is another question. There were plenty of colonists that were working with their governments to speculate in Western land before, during, and after the enactment of the Quebec Act. So how effective was it? But yes, it greatly troubled New Englanders in particular, not only because the Western land was now out of their control, but because there was this looming presence of a Catholic arc around New England. Yeah.
The wicked Catholics, right.
Catholics, yeah.
Next one is from Anonymous. Did any New Dealers draw inspiration from George?
That's a great question. There were New Dealers on the left and the right who draw inspiration from George. Rex Tugwell was enthusiastic about George. Many of the economists, and then there was conservatives. Whether or not Walton Hamilton drew inspiration from George is a good question. I have not researched this. One of the arguments that's made is that many of the anti-New Dealers took inspiration from George, and Albert J. Nock is perhaps the most famous, because George is skeptical of regulation. Remember I showed those cartoons?
Yeah.
The corrupt nexus? George's image of regulation is just that corrupt nexus updated. So he doesn't much like regulatory agencies. In fact, the leading Georgist in New Jersey in the 19-teens, a guy named George Record, he's not even enthusiastic about the Sherman Act. That's one of the beauties of the land tax, that you can contain the evil. He wants to contain the evil and not to control it. The New Dealers wanted to control it. That's a different impulse. And so that's a harder, there's a brilliant book coming out by Chris England on the legacy of the Georgists through the Progressive era and the New Deal. And he sees the linkages much stronger in the Progressive era, where control was more central than it was in the New Deal. In fact, it's been contended that the New Deal impulse was fundamentally a revival of this really quite mid-19th century break 'em up anti-monopoly impulse that's associated with Louis Brandeis. Very different from the progressivism, very different from Henry George. But it's a great question, and we could email on it if you want, because I might be able to come up with some more resources.
Wow. Let's see. Next one is Anonymous. Why was George against regulation? Was he against it in all cases? That's the question. For example, regulating child labor.
No. Look, he's not opposed to all regulation, but he is convinced that regulation is often a tool of powerful insiders to manipulate the rules of the game to benefit the few rather than the many. This is one reason that he's not necessarily enthusiastic about universal suffrage. He's really worried in Progress and Poverty that voters are going to be marched to the polls by corrupt bosses. And why is that? Or corrupt employers or corrupt bosses, doesn't much matter. And why is that? Because you voted the ticket in those days. The ballot was pre-printed by the parties and it had a different color. So everybody knew who you were voting for. Among George's lesser known innovations, and he was not the only one to make this innovation, but he went to Australia and he was very impressed with the new practice of having a printed ballot, which is now known as the Australian ballot. He was not the first to introduce it. Others, Richard Henry Dana, I think, introduced it in Massachusetts. But the idea that voting would be sacred and private and that it could not be manipulated by political elites, the same elites that were going to be passing laws for the benefit of the fat cats, that was very congenial for Henry George. He's not that enthusiastic about regulatory commissions. And he was very concerned that regulatory commissions could be captured by powerful insiders. Let me put it that way.
Okay. Did George, another anonymous attendee, did George talk about how monopolies intersect? For example, the way in which patent monopolies help trusts form.
Yes, he was very worried about that, the nexus, the corrupt interlinking of different monopolies. He does he write about specific, the two would have been, the sewing machines and reapers would have been the two that would have caused a lot of concern in the 1870s. I can't remember if he says anything specific about those two. And I don't know in the science and political economy if he expands on it, but that was the concern. And by the way, just to look at patents a little more broadly, let's name two industries, telegraph, railroad. Telegraph grew up around patents, railroad did not. Railroad managers were more likely to be extorted by patent holders who came up with inventions that they say, aha, you have this on your railroad, you have to pay us. The air brake is a classic example. So even big businesses can be extorted by patent fiends, they were called. And the whole patent system, which in its modern form goes back to 1836, was designed to help the little guy and little gal, and sometimes it did, but the way it worked out was it created this elite group of patent examiners, which you did not have in Britain, by the way. So you didn't have it in Britain. You didn't have a patent office at all in Switzerland at this time, but those elite examiners could easily collude with big business. And that happened in the case of the telegraph, happened in the case of the telephone. And George would have been suspicious for just the reasons that we've outlined.
Well, you see it's what's going on right now with Google and all. They have rafts of patents.
Correct.
Many of which probably should never have been issued.
Correct. Well, the example from the 1870s, 80s, 90s would have been Bell, which had the Bell telephone empire was built around patents. And I don't know if he wrote anything about it. Maybe somebody in the audience knows much more about that than I do, but he would have been very suspicious. Whereas with copyright, the thing, the information is accessible. It's out there.
I wanted to ask a question. I can't get on the Q&A, so I just thought I'd jump on and ask directly. It seems that there's two aspects to monopoly. One is the economic domination, and the other is the political domination that people like Facebook and Twitter are exerting. And the Act 230, the original, or Section 230, the original intent was to shield them from somebody putting something on their platform that was not legal.
Yep.
And it strikes me that the simplest thing is to say, but we will not shield you from removing something that was legal. In other words, when you censor people who were not legitimately censorable, you can be sued for that, but you cannot be sued for failing to censor something quickly enough when it has nudity or in libel or incendiary, whatever. And that struck me as addressing the political problem. It does not seem to address the economic problem, but
yeah, I mean, the Section 230 emerged long before Facebook, long before Google. There's very little nudity on Facebook. There's probably more now than there was 5 years ago. So Facebook is perfectly capable of establishing all kinds of boundaries, what's permissible and what's not. And all that operates independently of First Amendment. It's a corporation. The First Amendment is aimed at government. So, but we do have another body of law called the law of libel. And the law of libel is awkward. The law of libel is, it's different in different countries. It's much more permissive in the United States than it is, say, even in Britain. but it can have a deterrent effect, and it can get the attention of corporations. If these network platforms are not going to alter their algorithms, change their business strategy, then it seems to me that legislative tweaks around Section 230 can help to force the change. And we have not had a tradition of a, the idea of a complete, one of the most perverse claims that has been made is that Facebook's open access policy is the American tradition. I mean, before the Civil War, it was illegal to publish anything on slavery in the South. And in many cities, if you were publishing information that had to do with morals or some public figure, you would either be shut down by the paper, or the public figure or the journalist would come and beat you up. There have been all kinds of constraints on free expression in American history. It was bounded. It was also temporally limited. That is to say, Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, well, that was in the newspaper, but they stopped talking about it. It took about 150 years, if not more, for that to come back up. Whereas now, information by teenagers or whatever will live on forever. And it seems to me that if we're, the point of First Amendment is to promote a certain kind of civic discourse that will further experiment in free government. That's the point of it. It's not the end in and of itself. And if there are not limits and bounds, it does not seem to me that you can have that a civic space in which you're going to have the kind of engagement that's necessary to sustain the republic. And if you think that we are today in some kind of a nirvana with regard to circulation of information that's good for the civic polity, then I don't know what world you're living in, because what we're doing now is not working. So there's a presumption in favor of change.
I'll jump off and turn it back to Polly because there's a few more questions.
Yeah, they keep. Okay, here is, did George see an economy of mainly big firms or mainly small firms as part of his ideal vision?
That's a great question.
I mean, did he believe in the inevitability of concentration?
No. I mean, he's writing in the 1870s, and the big enterprises are railroad and telegraph. Okay, oil is there a little bit, but it's mostly railroad and telegraph. And Western Union has not consolidated under Gould. That would happen in January 1881, whereas the book comes out in 1879, but it's published in 1880. The presumption was that railroads were like canals, and they have to be big. And everybody knows canals are going to be big and expensive. So they are going to be common carriers that will make it possible for the rest of the economy to flourish. And the economy is still going to be commercial, primarily commercial agriculture. That was his vision, with shops and creative working men who are printers and coopers and blacksmiths and machine makers, that sort of thing. He does not have a vision of corporations. He doesn't write about a lot of corporations in Progress and Poverty either. I don't remember a memorable section on textile mills. I don't remember a memorable section on military armories or on manufacture of reapers. There's no conception that what economists would call economies of scale were going to become as important as they would in the 1880s, and especially after the Panic of 1893, when you have the Great Merger move. That's a different world. That's why I'm trying to contend that there's three visions of anti-monopoly. There's the vision of monopoly as a kind of political economy. Britain dominates the world. We need independence from tyranny. That's the revolution, the War of 1812. That's John Adams's vision. That's one vision of monopoly. Second vision of monopoly is the monopolization of natural resources, which are limited in his conception. You can argue, minerals at some point are going to run out, even though there's more oil than we ever thought, but they're limited. And maybe you could say the same about consciousness. And George's vision is that we can contain it. So we're going to contest the British. We're going to contain the private ownership of natural monopolies. Only after 1890 would there be a sea change in which we're going to accept these large-scale aggregates, and the goal now is to control these large-scale aggregates to promote public utility. For George, the vision is still equal rights versus special privilege, and equal rights are given us by God. That's the world. That was Abraham Lincoln's world. That's Henry George's world. In many ways, it's Thomas Jefferson's world. It's not John Adams's world because he's got a lot of Massachusetts merchants who are just waiting to get into international markets. And boy, do they want to get back into the West Indies, which the British has shut them out of. And that's his vision of monopoly. So there's not just one anti-monopoly tradition. I think that perhaps is one takeaway. In my period, there are at least three.
Let's see. Here is from another anonymous. What kind of innovations have emerged in Georgist anti-monopolist writing since George's death? I don't know whether you've already sort of answered that, but.
Yeah, well, he dies in 1897, and it's just when the merger movement is beginning, and he basically doesn't write about the merger. I mean, his great book on political economy never finishes. So if you want to think of the heir to George, it'd be Thorstein Veblen, next generation. And who was an academic, but he had a kind of unusual relationship. There's a new biography of Thorstein Veblen that suggests he's much more tied to previous debates, much less of this kind of Carleton College Norwegian farmer iconoclast. That he's much more connected to cosmopolitan currents, but he's certainly not a conventional academic economist, as conventional economics would come to be defined. So that's where I would go. I look at Veblen's business enterprise, theory of business enterprises.
Yeah.
That's where I would go.
Let's see, from Jack Brown. Would you care to speculate on a possible collaboration with Senator Hawley, who apparently supported the insurrection on Jan 6th? Well,
look, I'll leave that question for Matt Stoller, who I taught with last semester and have great admiration for. I'll leave that for Matt.
I wanted to follow up on the previous question, which Louis F. Post wrote a book called The Ethics of Democracy.
Yeah.
And he has a whole section on trusts. And and he furthers Henry George's point that breaking up trust is not the answer, because the underlying causes of trust are economic privileges, and you attack the trust by attacking the underlying privileges.
I'll amend my comment about Veblen, of course, Louis Post. He's a Georgist. He keeps the flame alive. He's a prolific journalist, I think mostly in Chicago, as a government official at one point, and that would be a place to go. But it's not quite as, the writing is not quite the same intellectual heft as Veblen. And for Veblen, I mean, the great duality for Veblen is between business and industry, which I see as a Georgist duality. Industry is creativity, it's genius, it's the kind of ideas you get when you have leisure, and he associates it with a particular social group, engineers, whereas it's the businessmen who are limiting output. They are the monopolists in Georgia.
So business is basically financial manipulation to them.
Exactly, and that is what's going to happen as long as you perpetuate these corrupt ties between business and government. But particularly with new technologies such as electricity, if there's a way for engineers to come to the fore, then engineers will have a different set of incentives, and they're concerned about long term. They're concerned. Henry Ford would be in that vision of a kind of a self-taught engineer in the Georgist mold, who in fact has been called a populist in a recent brilliant book by Stefan Link on Henry Ford in Michigan, in Germany, and in Russia. That's where I would see that tradition going forward. Then going forward to TVA. That's where George is. He's not a small, he's beautiful guy at all.
Something more recent that follows up on that is, I've seen this often, that the big downfall of American business has been the MBA programs, that so many people are put in charge of major corporations because they have a master's of business administration, and they tend to be chart chasers who don't understand the products that their businesses are making.
Well, my mentor, really one of the towering figures in 20th century economics, economic history, Alfred Chandler, he argued this his whole career. That the idea that you can manage any business just because you've got a piece of paper saying that you're an MBA is fatuous, and it has been extraordinarily destructive. And what's worse is that when you get people in that position who don't understand the business, all they understand is counting beans and moving around financial assets. And so many of the mergers have been disastrous in recent American business because they've been promoted by that kind of mentality, not by managers who really understood the business, who knew their onions, as we say. And that, yes, that's a problem. Another problem has been the shifting rules that has encouraged financialization. Another problem has been the tariff policy that has discouraged U.S. manufacturers as opposed to European manufacturers. Many, many things have happened since the 1940s. But the MBA would be high on the list after the academic economist as a real kind of a negative influence on the prosperity of American people. And we need to get back to basics in understanding business and get away from this obsession with finance, with speculation, with short-term returns, and with shareholder sovereignty.
Amen. We're sort of running out of time, but I have a long one from another anonymous attendee. How do you
They might all be the same anonymous attendee. That's
How do you interpret this bit from Progress and Poverty in the context of George's anti-monopolism? Quote, he doesn't say where from, nor is any remedy worth considering that does not fall within the natural direction of social development and swim, so to speak, with the current of the times. That concentration is the order of development. There can be no mistaking the concentration of people in large cities, the concentration of handicraft crafts in large factories, the concentration of transportation by rail and steamship lines,
right,
and of agricultural, whoops, it jumped, excuse me, of agricultural operation in large fields. The most trivial businesses are being concentrated in the same way. Errands are run and carpet sacks are carried by corporations. All the currents of the time run to concentration. To resist it successfully, we must throttle steam and discharge electricity from human service.
Right. I'd be interested to know if that was in Progress and Poverty. I don't remember it, but maybe it is. Sure, that's what he believes. He believes that the new forms of energy, steam power, electricity, are going to promote consolidation in certain realms. But it just depends upon 1879, or even if that comes from his Essays on Social Problems in 1884, or 5, whatever that is, it's very different from what happened after 1897. I don't think he had in his conception a billion-dollar corporation.
Right.
He might well have applauded it, but he just didn't have it in mind. And the idea that we are socialized, business socializes us, is a brilliant insight of Jeff Sklansky's in his book, The Soul's Economy, which has a very fine chapter in which he makes the rather astonishing claim that there's more in common between William Graham Sumner and Henry George, often seen as antagonists, than we often assume, because they both have this vision of a process of socialization. And that's really the idea I'm trying to get across here, that he does see the reason that urban land is valuable is not because you're so clever to have bought it. It's because there's a lot of activity going on in the environs. And that's a social fact, and like an Durkheimian sense. And that therefore, those social facts need to be recognized as a foundation for any sensible public policy.
Yeah, well, that's the boundless savanna in which people come together and the city grows as people come together and start interacting. It's quite an amazing passage.
So it may well be that he does not have a vision of limited, the idea of attention deficit, or the attention, there's only so much attention, right? That's one of the analogies I was making. You can get more through close contact in big cities. Creativity, cosmopolitanism is fostered. That's a very Georgist idea. It's nothing to do with laissez-faire. It's nothing to do with rugged individualism. The libertarians have just completely distorted George's core message.
Well, in theory, the social networks could do that. They often aren't, but they could.
Sure.
You know, Wynn pointed me to the context, and I took a quick look at it. That was the insufficiency of current remedies, and he was basically
That is in progress and poverty. Yeah.
yeah,
Mhm.
and he was basically saying you can't, that this concentration you cannot stop by regulation. That was his whole
Yeah.
point, that if you were to do that, you would have to you would have to you would have to get rid of the advantage of steam and stuff.
That's right. I remember the passage. That's right. He's claiming that it is inevitable. Yes, and I think
Yeah.
that a lot of people believe that, but that was not. I mean,
Well,
look,
he's claiming not so much that it's inevitable, but it's beyond the power of regulation or arbitrary measures.
and that was a
And-
common view for radicals in the 1870s and 80s. We've developed this peculiar reading of anti-monopoly history, small as beautiful. And I have a kind of conspiracy theory about that, was that the idea that small is beautiful is the antitrust tradition was promoted by big businesses in order to discredit it. And therefore Brandeis has been elevated as this towering figure who in fact believes in the MBA, believes in business management, believes in efficiency, believes in Taylorism, all those things. But the small is beautiful is a way to criticize and say that all these farmers and working men are hicks or are, they're not with it. But that is not the prevailing vision in the 1870s and 80s. George was smarter than that. So yes, it's just a question of how big.
Yeah, and it was
Well, it's
pointed
also,
out that.
no.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say the term concentration in this quote from George is not the same as our current meaning as a concentrated industry, because there's only 3 of them and they're talking to each other.
He's thinking of industrial districts. I mean, he's
Yeah,
always,
the Diamond District.
he's always a child of Philadelphia, which was the great center for specialized production, for diverse production in a district, like in a Marshallian sense, not one big factor. Yeah, that's all I'm saying. Because there wasn't much of that for him to talk. Go on. Sorry.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's that something I've seen that ties to that is that the failure of the Antitrust Act is the Rockefellers were no less happy with 32 humongous corporations than one gargantuan corporation.
Right. Here's my reading of that period. Antitrust goes in 1890. It was a joke. No one took it seriously. It was just you needed it in order to get your tariff bills through. Okay. And then with Knight, it looked like it's going to go away because if you could have what is 97% of the market in Philadelphia, but that's not interstate commerce and sugar. Well, and then chipping away at it with Peckham, he makes these draconian statements saying that basically any contract could be a restraint of trade. Well, that's a problem if you're in business. And so then with Taft, the greater hope was we were going to move toward national incorporation. National incorporation fails. You get the Mann-Elkins Act, so telegraph and telephone or common carriage, but national incorporation fails. And then you've got this problem as to how do you figure out what business decision is or is not going to get you into court and maybe into jail. And that's the rule of reason in 1911, which is an accommodation to big business. And the irony is that once they worked that out, then it became plausible to use antitrust for other things. So the great decade for antitrust, well, you could argue it's either the 30s or the 50s. But those were the great decades. Probably you'd get the best of the argument if you said it was the 50s. But you needed to make that accommodation to aggregates. Otherwise, the law was just unworkable. A very high percentage of the early antitrust prosecutions in the 1890s were against labor.
Yeah, that's right.
And that just delighted the jurists. And there's an argument that there was learned arguments about labor as illicit. In 1914, the two things really were the rule of reason. In 1914, you get the exemption of labor. Labor's not a commodity, and that makes it possible for antitrust to emerge. But it's got nothing to do with 1890. And to piously look back at what they said in that congressional debate, where the vote was almost unanimous. Look, there's a big debate over the Federal Trade Commission in 1914. So that the congressman saw there were stakes there. With the Sherman Act, it was just gassing off, and then such piety has been invested in those statements by these Chicago school economists who don't understand the meaning of consumer in 1890. And they don't understand the understanding of welfare in 1890. And yet that's become the rule of law. That's become the standard in the Supreme Court. It does a real disservice to our 19th century Republicans.
It also changed the definition of monopoly.
Yes.
Adam Smith's use of the word in the Oxford English Dictionary is one of the defining uses of monopoly, where he said the price of land is naturally a monopoly price. It is entirely on what people can afford to pay, not what the landholder can afford to take. And with the antitrust laws, everybody now defines monopoly bureaucratically. If somebody has more than 50% of the market, it's a monopoly, and if they don't, it's not. And that's a complete departure from classical liberalism.
I agree completely. And remember, for the founders of the United States, monopoly was British commercial systems. They can send ships to St. Eustatius in the West Indies and just blow the place up. That's the British commercial monopoly, so that only British ships are going to be able to get involved in that trade because they've got the biggest navy. That was what that's what the Americans feared around the time of the war. You think of our what was it? From the Algiers, we were worried about those pirates in the Algiers. That's because we didn't have the British fleet backing us up. For the halls of Tripoli. That's North Africa, because the Brits aren't protecting us anymore, as they had protected us before the war. We were delighted with the British commercial monopoly as long as we were under British, under the British control. But when that shifts, then it's a problem. So that's an understanding of it. And then the understanding of monopoly in the 19th century, I agree with this Smithian economistic direction, but it's just any large-scale ownership of land that is not being worked, which is an unworkable definition, but a lot of people believed it. They really believed in small-scale ownership of land, and that's the impetus behind the Homestead Act. And it worked as long as you're on this side of the 100th meridian and you can farm because you have enough rainfall. But once you get west of the 100th meridian, it gets a lot dicier.
I think,
Have we done it?
I don't see any more questions scrolling through, and you've given me so many questions that I wouldn't know where to begin, so I maybe will write them. But this has been absolutely wonderful, and I thank you.
And the movie I couldn't remember was called The Social Dilemma. If there's any way you could get that in there, I couldn't remember the name of that movie.
Yeah, and before Sue is going to thank our sponsors again, and before she does, I just wanted to point out two things. One is that in March 18th, 4 weeks from today, we're going to interview Carl Fitzgerald on land value tax in Australia. The nickel tour is that it made great progress in the 50s to 70s and then backslid as taxes were shifted to the state and national governments. And then they're making some progress again today that the Canberra Capital Territory, or Australia Capital Territory, which is Greater Canberra, it's like Washington, D.C., only geographically larger, is moving toward land value tax today. And that will be next month. And then the other thing is that we're working on a system where people who have become subscribers who've paid $99 as like a conference fee can get together and not just be in a webinar, but can talk online. And we can have events where we follow up, like the YouTube video of this, we can discuss it with each other online. And we're also working to create a channel where anybody who's a conference subscriber can talk to each other at any time just by clicking that channel. And if anybody else is on, or if you contact somebody and say, jump on this channel, then you can do that. So that's all I have. And Sue, I will turn it over.
All right. Like to thank our 2021 sponsors again: Polly Cleveland, Mario Cordova, Kathleen Cummings, Damon Gross, Gib Halverson, Sue Hunzel, Dave Jassel, Ralph Rivera, Mark Sullivan, Asamu Uehara, the Center for Public Dialogue, and Walt Rybeck, Earth Sharing Associates, the Henry George Institute, International Union for Land Value Taxation, the Public Revenue Education Council, and the Robert Schalkenbach Foundation. We thank you and have a good evening. Thank you very much. Bye for now.